His hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
To protect America from nuclear devastation, a protective shield in the sky, the President's Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars.
SDI may be the difference between an arms control and an arms reduction agreement with the Soviets on the one hand, and a runaway arms race not only on Earth but in space for the next 50 years.
The most ambitious and the biggest military program of all time. Will it bring in a new age of technology and riches for America, or will it make us poorer?
It costs a vast amount. It is bad for our security. It takes effort which could otherwise be used on real military programs.
About 3 seconds. That's it.
Will Star Wars research give American business a new competitive edge?
It's very much like the space programs in the sense that there are a lot of unexpected fallout, spin-off, whatever you want to call them, that will be of great benefit on the totally civilian side.
First, it won't work. Second, it's dangerous. Third, it's a waste of money.
Tonight, Star Wars, the bottom line. What will it cost, and how will it affect our economic and technological future? I'm Harding Carter, and behind me here in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., are some missiles whose nuclear capability the President would, in his own words, render obsolete and impotent. His vision of a defensive shield in the sky, a vision that would turn the old doctrine of deterrence and mutual fear on its head, would again, using his words, change the course of human history and of the nuclear age. But at what cost? Will it work? And what kind of change? Groups of businessmen, economists, and those who think about America's future wealth and prosperity are beginning to calculate the cost of SDI. Recently in New York, business executives for national security organized a conference to examine the economic consequences of Star Wars.
As business people, we must know what's happening around us and how it might either stimulate or stymie our free enterprise efforts. The President's SDI program, if it proceeds as proposed by him, will inevitably need increasing levels of support over time. And we business folks had better take a good look at what SDI will mean to us now and down the line.
What will it mean? The President's original idea was a startling one, to find technological deliverance from the threat of nuclear annihilation. Many critics have concluded that a reliable shield against all-out missile attack is a dangerous delusion. But let's take a look at that original idea of President Reagan. Enemy missiles have been launched at the United States. Out in space is a layered American defense system already in place. U.S. spy satellites watching the world below detect the enemy missiles as they are launched. In this, the so-called boost phase, the 3 or 4 minutes after the missiles are blasting off, the spy satellites would alert battle stations, on the ground as well as up in space. Kinetic energy weapons, a form of high-tech machine gun, would fire high-speed projectiles to intercept the missiles as they rise through the atmosphere. Those that make it, each releasing its load of warheads, enter outer space in the so-called mid-course, which lasts for 20 minutes. Rays from powerful land-based lasers are directed and redirected by huge orbiting mirrors, and chemical lasers fire at the warheads as they hurtle through space. Thousands of dummy warheads thrown out by the enemy missiles would complicate the task of the sensors, lasers, and particle beams. Those that survive will re-enter the atmosphere and drop toward their targets, the cities and towns of America. Now comes a massive bombardment of ground-based projectiles. Like steel-ribbed fishing nets, they will catch the remaining nuclear warheads and destroy them before they reach their targets. That's the theory. a vision of how SDI might free the world from the nuclear nightmare, a perfect defense. But critics argue that it can't be done, and that far from making the world safer, it will unleash a new and dangerous arms race with the Soviet Union and remove all chances for arms control. Former CIA Director William Colby is an opponent of SDI and one of the sharpest critics of its reliability.
Now, if you can develop a 95% efficiency with SDI, it sounds very good indeed to, I don't mean just the technology, I mean the management of it and how it's done, all the rest of it. Well, 95% of 8,000 warheads which are currently aimed at us by the Soviet Union, strategic ones, means that only 400 will get through. Only 400 onto our soil. Now that, I say, it won't work. Of course, there are lots of other nuclear weapons, the cruise missiles and all that sort of thing, which are not affected by a barrier such as this. We would have to develop an air defense system in order to prevent the bombers or the cruise missiles or whatever.
Dr. Richard Garwin, another prominent critic, believes that even the Pentagon has abandoned the concept of a totally reliable defensive shield.
The SDI program is an answer in search of a question. Any argument serves just so it persuades the listener. But the President had a clear goal in his March 1983 Star Wars speech. He said that deterrence of nuclear war works, has worked, and will continue to work, but the American people deserve something better than the moral desert of basing our survival on the threat to destroy another nation. So he asked the scientific community to provide the tools to render ballistic missiles impotent and obsolete by intercepting them before they touched our soil or that of our allies. What he was asking for, clearly, was a defense so good that the United States could give up our own nuclear weapons and not threaten anyone. And I think that is a marvelous goal. Unfortunately, the SDIO is not working on it. They ridicule the idea that anybody ever thought that could be done, and they argue in a tortured fashion that there is another meaning to rendering nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, and that's what they're doing to add to offensive deterrence.
SDI is still only a research program to last through until 1989. At Reykjavik, the Russians made it clear that they wanted it to remain confined to the laboratory. The President refused. The talks broke down over SDI. At an earlier summit in 1972, President Nixon and Mr. Brezhnev signed an anti-ballistic missile treaty, which is still in force. For us to deploy or even test the various Star Wars systems, many argue that the treaty would have to be amended or broken. Deployment was originally scheduled for the mid-1990s. Now there's talk of an earlier, more limited deployment. And there's anxiety in Washington and allied capitals that the administration may be planning to abrogate the ABM Treaty of 1972. We talked to Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger and asked him whether there will now be an earlier, more limited deployment.
We are not ready to deploy yet. We have said that repeatedly. We are not ready to decide to deploy because we don't have a system yet that we regard as thoroughly reliable or able to do an effective job of destroying Soviet missiles before they get near any targets on Earth. We're working on it, and we're making very much greater progress.
Is there now a race to deploy before Reagan leaves the White House?
I don't really know. It's not going to depend on whether the administration ends or not, or we're not racing to beat the clock or anything of that kind. We're trying our very best to get a thoroughly reliable defense against Soviet missiles. This is what we've been trying to do since 1983.
What they're trying to do is get into the budget this year and next year enough of the preparatory steps aimed at deployment in the early 90s so that that becomes almost a momentum of its own, and we go ahead and deploy in the early 90s and let the diplomats straighten it out after we've done the facts. This is totally irresponsible in my view, and it has required them to come up with this creative reinterpretation of the ABM Treaty to do that. But that's clearly the intention of some of the people in the administration.
Are we going to break the ABM Treaty?
Actually, the President concluded in 1985 that the legally correct interpretation of the treaty was that based on the so-called Agreed Statement D, which when you're working with things that weren't in existence at the time of the signing of the treaty are not governed by it.
The Soviets and ourselves agreed not to develop nationwide ABM systems. Now, the administration has come through with some creative legal reasoning which says that they can do all the experiments they need on anything but the weapons that were there in existence then. Now that's like making a treaty to bar the bow and arrow and not barring the development of future weapons. It's nonsense.
Last year, the Congress voted some $3 billion for SDI research, which is about $13 per every man, woman, and child in the United States. Over the next decade, SDI research is expected to cost about $26 billion, which makes it the most expensive R&D program ever. Of course, both a weakened White House and Democratic control of the Senate could reduce those numbers somewhat. But whatever the level, the question is, where is the money going? One technology crucial to Star Wars is lasers. These are pulses of very intense light that might be able to destroy missiles in their boost phase or in the mid-course. But there have been no mid-air tests even against dummy warheads. So the Defense Department has had to rely on controversial simulations, such as this one in 1985, where a chemical laser called Miracle was trained on an empty missile casing. It was tied down under pressure, which the Pentagon says would be similar to conditions of an actual encounter. Much of the work on lasers and particle beams is taking place at the National Research Laboratories. The lion's share has gone to the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, over $700 million since 1983 for X-ray laser and other research. Los Alamos has received almost $200 million, and the Sandia National Laboratory in New Mexico nearly $100 million since 1983. And large corporations have received huge grants too, some at the expense of the science labs, as the administration pushes for a faster deployment of an anti-missile defense. In 1985, these were the top four. Boeing, the leading commercial contractor, spent $153 million on sensor research. TRW, $96 million on lasers and propulsion problems. Rockwell, 44 on semiconductors, sensors, and space-based power systems. And Lockheed, $42 million on optical systems, kinetic energy weapons, lasers, and propulsion. Altogether, there is work being done on 14 different technologies.
Some friends of mine who are scientists and very distinguished scientists believe that SDI requires several breakthroughs, fundamental breakthroughs in technologies, maybe 8 or 10, each of which would be the equivalent of the Manhattan Project in its dimension.
The Star Wars researchers clearly have a long way to go. The computers and the programs to manage the Star Wars systems may prove the hardest problem to solve. The Maxwell Company, San Diego. Here, great strides have been made with an electromagnetic railgun, a kinetic energy weapon that fires projectiles at incredible speed, up to 2 miles per second, and could be a useful mid-course defense.
Firing.
There's obviously a great distance to go, in more ways than one, from Maxwell's San Diego lab to a working system in space.
That was a great shot.
In the early 1960s, President Kennedy challenged America's scientists to land a man on the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Houston,
Oh, jeez.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
To land Neil Armstrong on the moon cost $24 billion, about $80 billion at today's prices. But the Apollo project was small potatoes compared to the possible cost of deploying the SDI. And the Apollo project was not something an adversary was attempting to shoot down or cripple, thereby driving up the cost even further in an effort to prevent that from happening. How much will SDI cost? Can America afford to live up to President Reagan's dream?
I think the cost to the country economically is very, very large, but I think that if we came to the conclusion that we had to have it because it made the world safe, we could afford the cost. Now, we might have to put in taxes to pay for it because nothing comes cheap, and we might have to have a degree of austerity in this country that we haven't been prepared to accept. But I believe that before we even get to that, we have to know what the system is supposed to do.
Well, I think it's very manageable. It's my understanding, and I've received top briefings by the Defense Department, by the Strategic Defense Office, that we're talking in terms of having a 3-layer defensive system using existing kinetic energy capabilities that will cost about 4 or 5% over 10 years of the defense budget. I think that's affordable. We have a defense budget that's $300 billion. I think we can use 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 or $10 billion of that per year to design and put in place a system designed to defend our homeland.
I think you're talking of something around $700–800 billion, and this is absurd. If you add that on to our defense budget for the next, say, 10 years, $700 billion, that's $70 billion more dollars onto defense for the next 10 years, you begin to see the awesome nature. We have doubled our national debt in the last 5–6 years, and we are in very serious problems because of the size of this debt.
The Council on Economic Priorities has also estimated the cost coming in at around $800 billion. And 2 former defense secretaries, James Schlesinger and Harold Brown, have gone even further. They estimate a cost of $1 trillion. That's $1,000 billion. Caspar Weinberger.
People who reach these conclusions of these absolutely virtually unthinkable amounts have the advantage of not really knowing anything about it. And then it's always easy to make a prediction when you don't have to be troubled with the facts.
If anybody has displayed before Congress his lack of knowledge of a program ever, as Secretary of Defense, it has been he. Not only on SDI, but on MX and many other things.
Everyone knows that Teflon was produced by space scientists working on the moon program. The military and space agencies have a long history of spearheading new products. World War II, for instance, produced a cornucopia of new ideas for peacetime. Plowshares out of swords. What will Star Wars bring? In a study released last year, the business communications company of Stamford, Connecticut, produced a highly optimistic report on the possible commercial value of SDI spinoffs. They estimated that in the 40 years from 1990 through to 2030, sales from the exploitation of Star Wars technologies could range from $125 billion a year to $500 billion. Is this kind of talk sufficient justification for going ahead with the program?
No, it should not be a justification for the program. I do, however, believe there'll be lots of technological spin-offs that we will be able to apply to non-military uses, medical uses, engineering uses, peaceful explorations of outer space, improving our laser technology, sensor technology that can be used in communications, that could be used as far as gaining intelligence, which is important for the United States. There's going to be a lot of spin-offs, there's no doubt about it. But that's not the justification. That's a nice side benefit.
It's the world's most expensive way to get a spinoff. I mean, I agree that we need to put more money in our country into research and development, but we should do it into the kinds of things that other countries put them into, which are economically promising areas, and not hope to get an incidental benefit from an enormously expensive project. The irony is that it's the best bargaining chip that we've had in years. The fact about weapon systems is that while they're planned, they are good bargaining chips. When they actually get constructed and put in place, it's almost impossible to get rid of them in the negotiating process.
Colorado Springs, a town of 380,000, home to NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command, buried deep under nearby Cheyenne Mountain. There are 5 major military installations here, and soon there will be a 6th, the National Testing Facility for the SDI, where a new generation of supercomputers will run Star Wars simulation tests. A few miles east of the town is Falcon Air Force Station, which houses CSOC, the new Consolidated Space Operations Center, which will eventually control all military space activity. Already, 23% of the personal income in Colorado Springs comes from the military. The Cayman Sciences Corporation is already working on SDI. It has a $40 million contract to test laser pointing and tracking systems. Honeywell recently constructed a clean room to build a new generation of high-speed microchips for possible use as SDI components. There are about 4 million scientists, engineers, and technicians working in America today. Of these, perhaps 14% are working on military research and development projects, 18,000 on SDI. The director of the SDI organization is Lieutenant General James Abramson. He travels the country visiting companies large and small that are working on SDI research. Here at the Martin Marietta plant near Denver, Colorado, work is going on to perfect a system to help space-based lasers point and track incoming warheads.
That has got to be the ultimate relation to the movie that we don't like to talk about and relate our program to Star Wars. But the one good thing, and I've said this, and maybe some of you have even heard me say it, the one real relationship to not only that movie, but perhaps others, is that the good guys won. And the good guys won because of the force that was with them.
Abramson argues SDI will pay for itself through commercial spin-offs. But others who have studied the defense industry doubt whether the products of Star Wars will be easily transformed into industrial processes in the consumer economy.
The skills involved seem to be so different that people who learn how to build these large, complicated military systems with the strict performance requirements, the fairly lax cost requirements, do not seem to be able to turn around and build systems that are cost-effective, marketable, can be produced in large quantities in an efficient way.
There's very little incentive in the defense procurement system or the defense R&D system for manufacturing excellence, because the number of things that are ordered, for the most part, is so small that it doesn't pay to invest in very efficient production facilities. Some people in Washington talk of bankrupting the Soviets, of simply outspending them on defense and forcing them to the bargaining table. But in a time of over $220 billion deficits, a national debt over $2 trillion and growing, and an international trade deficit of $173 billion, the real question is, can America afford it? If the funds must come from existing military budgets, would that mean fewer conventional forces, or perhaps fewer offensive missiles, or less non-SDI research and development? Or perhaps it would mean raising taxes or reducing domestic programs. The battles here on Capitol Hill will be painful, bloody, and fierce. Can America afford SDI beyond the current R&D phase, itself the most expensive ever?
The SDI R&D budget is greater than the entire budget of the Army, research budget of the U.S. Army, according to Representative Bennett. And we surely need better conventional weapons more than we need an exploration of unlimited time and tens of billions of dollars of what strategic defense can do.
My argument is there's enough money to go around. We're talking in terms of a small percentage of the defense budget, not a large percentage of the national budget, but a fraction of the defense budget, and no higher than in any given year 10% of the defense budget.
The current request for defense funds for SDI is over $6 billion. It ought to be cut to 3.1. This is for research. And going ahead that fast at $6 billion, assuming you could do it well, would still be very wasteful. All programs that we've had that we've flooded with money have always resulted in waste and corruption. 3.1 is all that we should have, in my opinion, this year.
I think that when you look at our trade deficits, when we look at our budgetary deficits and doubling the national debt every 4 years, that you might get into a quite new historical position in the United States if we're not careful. Historically, economic power and military power have always gone together. With nuclear weapons, together with our weakened economic posture, we might find ourselves in a position, or our children or our grandchildren, where we are a leading military power and a second-rate economic power. I don't think that's a situation that's tenable, and I think that's not a situation we should allow to be created.
See the Nile River from an Egyptian luxury cruiser next on River Journeys. Then at 10, join Ellen Thomas for the modern workout, Hooked on Aerobics. It's all right here on Channel 11.
For a transcript, please send $5 to Business Executives for National Security, Urim Building, Suite 300, 21 DuPont Circle Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20036. For information on obtaining a video cassette, contact Business Executives for National Security at the same address. Funding for this program was provided by BrokerNet Incorporated, David H. Horowitz, the Lippincott Foundation Incorporated, and Kenneth F. Montcastle, Jr., the Plowshares Fund, Alan Sagner, and the Frank P. and Mary Jean Smeal Foundation.